anticipated problems, even if they do materialize, are often short-term. So traffic patterns adjust. You know, there may be an increased traffic for a while, but then commuters figure out pretty quickly that if they leave 10 minutes early or 15 minutes later, they're going to avoid that real traffic rush. And in fact, in most school districts, support for the change grew once the change had taken place, because the community saw how valuable this was. These are some resources of websites which have additional information about start time changes, including ours, which is smartschoolstart.org. And all these websites have very good basic information on biology, sleep, circadian rhythms, the impact of sleep deprivation, and information about start times in general. So that's what I have to say. Thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
A few of us are going to gather the note cards. Anyone has questions on the note cards for Dr. Owens?
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, absolutely. Okay, here's a good one. Typically, how many years are required to begin the thought of changing start times to making the change occur? Well, you know, as I said, in Fairfax County, it's taken 15 years to sort of go through the process. But that's why I think some of the things I talked about in the lessons learned section are really important, because if you have a superintendent and a school board, in particular, who are in favor of this, that is a huge advantage to moving this agenda forward. So, you know, I think it's realistic to expect that it may take 3 or 4 or even 5 years to implementation. There are some school districts like Wilton, Connecticut, which is much smaller, which did it in 2 years, essentially. So, you know, if the leadership, school leadership in the community is on board, and there's not a major vocal opposition group. And it definitely is in your best interest to identify those groups that may be against us, and to start to dialogue and work with them from the very beginning. Because what happened in Fairfax County in 2008, to an extent, was the swim parents, which was a very small group, but a very, very vocal minority, kind of came out of the blue at the very 11th hour of this and convinced the school board to not vote it in. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and you know, as I alluded to in my presentation, one of the things I hear most often is, this won't do any good because they'll just stay up an hour later and they won't get any more sleep. And that's simply not true. So part of the opposition may be simply misinformation. And that becomes important, to have everybody hearing the same information as close to the same time as possible. Okay, good. Okay. How does exercise and athletics participation after school affect a student's sleep drive? That's a little bit of a complicated question, and part of the answer is I don't think we have enough of a good handle But certainly daily exercise is very important to good sleep. On the other hand, vigorous exercise within a couple of hours of bedtime may raise your core body temperature enough to make it more difficult to fall asleep. So that's a potential issue. And certainly sports practices that are going on much later than 9 o'clock probably are not in students' best health interests. I mentioned the issue of reduced sports-related injuries in students who are well-rested. And I think that's something that we need to take a much closer look at. Certainly none of the schools, districts that have changed their start times have seen a negative impact on either the performance of their athletic teams or participation by students in athletics. So I think athletics, while very important and that needs to be addressed, is a little bit of a red herring. And I think is certainly not an unsolvable issue by any means. Okay. What are sleep considerations related to ADD and ADHD? Okay, well, so I ran an ADD clinic for 25 years before I came to Children's, and so I'm very familiar with this whole interplay between ADHD and sleep. And, you know, this is a topic that is deserving of another hour and a half, but let me just say that certainly children with primary sleep disorders, particularly obstructive sleep apnea, can have many symptoms which are very similar to children with ADHD. So inattentiveness, impulsivity, mood dysregulation, hyperactivity look very similar. By the same token, children who aren't getting adequate sleep because of the impact on behavior and mood and prefrontal cortex, some of the things that I mentioned in my talk, also tend to have an overlap in terms of symptoms looking like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So my take on that is that before a child is diagnosed with ADHD, they need to have their sleep evaluated. And that doesn't necessarily mean they need to have an overnight sleep study, but they need to have someone take a systematic approach to asking the right questions about whether or not that child may have an underlying sleep disorder, may not be getting adequate sleep, or there's some other problem with their sleep that can be resulting in some of these daytime symptoms. Now, in addition to that, children with ADHD and autism spectrum disorders as well also have a much higher prevalence of sleep problems. Some of that is due to medication, but a lot of it is not. And in fact, in children with autism, we know that their melatonin levels and the way that melatonin is released and the pattern of melatonin and some of the receptors to do with melatonin are abnormal. And so there's, again, this biological sort of basis for sleep problems in that particular population. Okay. Have American high school start times always been this early? Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And the answer is no. And we actually are just in the process of finishing a report on sort of the history of school start times and also the process in terms of how other schools have done this. And it was back in the 1950s that start times started to become earlier. And because of increased need for busing, so all kids couldn't go to school at the same time. So at that point, you know, there wasn't this scientific evidence to demonstrate that adolescents need more sleep, that their circadian rhythms are changed during adolescence. So rather than having young kids wait for buses in the dark in the morning, many school districts elected to have the high schools start earlier. And so it was not really a decision that was made for the benefit of students. It was made oftentimes for economic reasons, for schools being forced to do more with less in the way of funding, and other kinds of budgetary concerns that really drove this whole process of starting high schools early. And unfortunately, it turned out to be a very poor decision. What other countries start their secondary schools? Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think it's highly variable. Certainly in many Asian countries, the school day is longer, and also in European countries as well. And so I think by and large, and you know, it's so variable across different countries that it's really hard to make generalizations. But I think probably the U.S. in general starts their high schools earlier than most other countries do. Let's see. Why don't high schools delay start time more than an hour? Well, that's a very good question. So probably the optimal start time is more like 9 o'clock. But I know, for example, in Fairfax County, that was just simply not going to fly. Because of the dismissal time would then be an hour and 10 minutes later, and that was going to impact really community use of recreational sports facilities. That really has become sort of the bottom line in terms of how far we can push. I'm hoping we're going to be at around 8:30, which will be more than an hour difference from the current start time. But you know, there are many communities around the country which start at around 9 o'clock for high schools. Let's see, in children who have depressed melatonin, is increased screen exposure, does melatonin supplementation in the evening help? Interesting question. What I would suggest, rather than give supplemental melatonin, is to reduce screen exposure. Obviously, you know, honestly, I would much rather, and there are actually now filters which you can put, you can adjust your computer screen to reduce blue light. So there are apps that can do that for you. And, you know, it's not just the light exposure from screens, it's the fact that, you know, being on the computer or watching TV is cognitively stimulating and isn't really the best thing to do, even though many adults do it. You know, watching TV before bed probably isn't the best use of your time anyway. So I would not want to see, essentially, I mean, yes, synthetic melatonin is analogous to the hormone that your body produces, but it's still an extraneous substance with, we don't know what possible long-term side effects. We think for the most part it's safe, but there have been no studies which have looked at long-term side effects of melatonin. So I would not recommend going down that road. Can you please speak more about the impact on how athletics was addressed? Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about the issue of downtime. You know, really looking at what is the time frame between the dismissal bell and when student athletes actually get on the bus or actually get on the practice field. And could that be optimized? You know, even doing things like having the athletes do their wrapping on the bus rather than prior to getting on the bus. There may have to be some adjustments in game times, but you know, typically those aren't radical enough to disrupt the entire league. There are some instances where schools have to travel long distances to play other schools even within the district. And in that case, contemplating the issue of early dismissal or making the last period of the day a study hall for student athletes, I think there are a lot of ways to work around this. And again, I want to emphasize that no schools, no districts which have changed their start times have seen a negative impact on athletics, performance, or participation. So this is something that is doable. It takes some work, and it may take some cooperation with neighboring school districts, but I mentioned Wilton, Connecticut. They pride themselves on being a sports town. And, their teams always were among the highest ranked in the state. And they are the only district in their area that delayed their start times. Despite a high level of interest from surrounding districts, they haven't pulled the trigger. But they have managed to cooperatively work on this without having a negative impact. And in fact, the perception was that the performance of their teams became even better because the students were better rested. Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
We're wrapping up the question and answers so that Dr. Owens can get home and get to sleep before her Radio Times interview tomorrow with Jody. I want to thank everyone for coming, but I particularly want to thank Dr. Owens for coming up from Washington, D.C. to speak to us tonight. Thank you so much. In addition, next Monday night, April 7th at 7 p.m., somewhere here at Lower Merion High School, we will have discussion groups with administrators to discuss what we've heard tonight and to see where we want to how we want to move going forward to help our teenagers get more sleep. So I hope to see many of you then. We'll put that out in the listservs. Also, Dr. Owens' presentation and PowerPoint will be in the listservs. We'll let you know where it is. It will be on the district website and will be on the district cable TV channel within a week. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
This has been a Ricky Reports production.
So no one has to pick them up.